Hi, I'm Alex Lischak, and you are listening to the Wayback Podcast. Now, this isn't really an actual podcast, it's more like an audiobook for the novel that I'm writing. I'm currently finishing the first draft of my novel that's been taking me almost 2 years to complete. And on top of that, I want to start narrating it, even though I haven't finished it yet. Isn't that weird? But I really like the story that I'm telling, and I wouldn't have written this story if I didn't find that it would be compelling, not just to me, but to the audience. So I hope you get something out of this, not just this reading, but this story that I hope to be telling in a very compelling way. And besides the narration episodes for every chapter, there are going to be about 50 of them. So it's going to take me a long time to do these. But I hope to also sprinkle in some episodes about character analysis or setting or plot. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask your question on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter and ask that, because the more people who have the same questions, the more motivated I will be to answer those questions in a full-fledged video on this podcast. So I don't want to just do narration videos. I want to do other things. And if you really like the story and you would like to support me, the best way to do that is to just write a review. Because when you write a review, my podcast gets more noticed on the interweb, on iTunes, and other podcast areas. So that is really the best way you can support me. Also, if you do not like it, you can write a review, but I think that also helps me. So if you don't like it, and you don't want other people to notice it, I guess don't write a review. But I mean, you know what? Just do whatever you want. But if you do want to support me, that is the best way. So I think that's it. Here we go. The very first chapter of my novel. Let's do this. All right. Part 1. Wayward Son. Chapter 1. The Buck. He wasn't even standing 100 feet away from me. His neck bent down quietly as his wet nose scrounged around under the frozen leaves. His tan stomach moved calmly as the frozen mist whisked from his nose as he breathed. He didn't look my way since he traveled in my direction. I just sat with my back against a tree, gazing at him as he looked for something under the bushels of leaves. After hours of staring at colorless tree branches which reached into a colorless sky and feeling the crystallized wind brush harshly against my face, I couldn't bear to quickly take his life. When I finally saw him moving in the distance, my eyes fixed on the beautiful creature whose only mission was to find some food. There was pity for him as he maneuvered his way through the lonely trees. Where was his family? Or had other hunters taken their lives too? "Shoot," Joseph whispered to me. I ignored him, but it seemed like the buck hadn't, because his white ears perked with his eyes following. Then it was he and I staring back at each other. I sat motionless, and for many moments we didn't disconnect from each other. I was amazed that the buck didn't even seem to care that I was holding a gun beside me. He breathed regularly as before as he chewed something in his mouth. I sensed he knew what I was up to, but for some reason, I could sense a mutual relationship between us. Right there on the frozen ground, I decided to befriend the animal and let him roam in peace. But it suddenly snapped when I heard a loud shot from my left, leaving the buck lying dead on the cold leaves. My body jerked over to Joseph, noticing that he had my gun in his hand. It was awful enough that he killed the innocent creature, but using my weapon made me more infuriated with him. "What the hell?" I screamed at him. "What?" Joseph said, thinking as if it was no big deal. "The buck was right there." "He was my friend." "Your friend?" Joseph didn't understand. He never seemed to understand. He didn't understand that I didn't want to do this, and he didn't understand that I wanted nothing to do with him or this lousy hunting trip. I was dragged up the Appalachian slopes and into the densely gray forest because of my mother. It was her will that I skipped a whole week of school only to have some bonding time with her boyfriend. Mom claimed that he was simply a good friend, but I could tell they had deeper feelings for each other. and I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for it. Joseph wanted me to field dress the buck with him, but I refused. Instead, I sat there against that tree as he went over to the dead carcass alone. Maybe boredom was a factor, but I eventually left since I could not bear to see that innocent animal be torn apart like it was nothing more than fresh meat. Joseph didn't say a word as I parted. He knew I was uncomfortable, and I knew he tried hard to be on my good side. He wasn't doing a very good job at it. My brother Eli was reading on the sofa as I entered the yellow shack. His feet were propped on the coffee table near the lit fireplace, silently looking up from his book as I rushed past him. He could tell I didn't get a deer. Eli had been out all week with Joseph, and towards the end of it, Eli had shot one himself, which apparently was very impressive for a 12-year-old kid. I spent most of the week inside, enjoying the peacefulness of having no one else but myself. Every day, though, Joseph kept nagging me to hunt with him. He told me it would be a life-changing experience, but I tried to tell him that Eli enjoyed hunting more than me, and that he should take him. And he did. But today was the last day before we left this godforsaken place, and Joseph felt like it would be a disservice if he didn't take me at least once. Eli felt the same way, and offered for me to hit him if I didn't kill anything. By all of this, I had no choice but to drag my feet out into the woods, and now coming back all fumed, Eli got the full extent of my hatred. I thought he was more worried where Joseph was, but it wasn't long for him to piece together that it didn't end well. A while later, as I lay on a bed in what was my bedroom for the week, I heard the kitchen door open and Joseph's voice calling to Eli. He wanted my brother to help him drag the animal back with him, and soon I was alone. It was dusk when they both came back. I was in the kitchen at the time when the two were joyfully conversing with each other, stating how starved they were. "Isn't that what the buck is for?" I said to Joseph sarcastically. Joseph didn't say anything. He didn't seem angry either. Instead, he looked wounded and confused. The anger inside me began to boil to the surface, so I left the situation by putting on my boots and heavy winter coat and stepping outside. I looked into the woods as I sat on the edge of the porch. The orange sunset shone through the trees. I fixed my focus on the silhouettes, not wanting to think about anything else. I eventually calmed myself down. I thought I could go inside and not say anything to Joseph, be polite and respectful like my mom instructed me to do, but he decided to join me out on the porch instead. It was some time that I sat outside, because he had 2 plates in his hands filled with food. He handed me one, which I placed next to me since my appetite to eat was lost. I secretly hoped he would simply turn and go back inside, but instead, he sat on the porch's edge, next to me. I braced myself for what he was about to say, but he just ate quietly to himself. I decided that I should too, since it was perfectly good food, and my appetite seemed to somehow return. There was silence for a while, but like I thought, Joseph ended up breaking it. I thought he was going to reprimand me for not taking the shot, but he didn't even mention it. "My father used to take me hunting," he said. I didn't say anything, so he continued. "This was his cabin at one time. We used to come up here every chance we had. He taught me everything I knew about hunting. It was this very place where he taught me. Those woods you're looking at, they are the same woods where I got my first buck. When I first laid eyes on it, I could not do it. I let it go. My father was furious with me, let me tell you. He had me wake up the next morning earlier than the rest of them. It was still dark, and I didn't have a great rest that night. I was half asleep, but he and I trudged through the darkness with his flashlight and our guns. We were walking for quite some time when we saw a whole pack of them sleeping. I had never seen a sleeping deer before, and I didn't want to end their peacefulness, but Dad had different plans. He made me shoot the largest one. And I did. What could have I done? My dad wouldn't let me head back to sleep until I shot one. What's the point of this? I finally posed. I just wanted to let you know that I was in exactly your position my first time hunting. I felt horrible killing such an innocent creature. I didn't know why men did such things. It wasn't until I was your age and a senior in high school that I found out why my father went hunting. I found out that all these years he went hunting because he wanted to escape the cruelty of this world. He wanted to stop all the dividing views and teach his son not just hunting, but to teach him everything he knew, without the world telling his son differently. He was protecting me in a way he only knew how. I saw the light in him, and when I finally realized that, I found out that he didn't go hunting because he wanted to kill a deer. He went hunting because he didn't want to be killed by the world. "Why do you go hunting?" I asked. "Why did you take me and my brother?" Joseph was silent for a moment, but I could see he had an answer. "Because I love you," he said. "I want to be with you, and I thought you might have felt the same." I stood up, knowing how to end the conversation. "If you loved me, then you would stay far away from me and my family as possible. If you really loved me, you'd leave me alone." I had nothing else to say to him, and he was too shocked to say anything back, so I stomped inside, wishing that conversation never began. We were both silent to each other for the rest of the trip. In the morning, I kept to myself as I gathered all my belongings together. I didn't speak when Joseph made breakfast. He simply gave me what he made. I didn't say thank you. He didn't request a response. I could see that Joseph, in a way, was crushed by what I had said last night. Ever since then, he walked around like a wounded dog. He tried to hide it, but I could see that he was hurt. Eli, my 12-year-old brother who grew to love the man, couldn't even hold a conversation with him. They were always talking about something, but this morning was an eerily quiet morning. I knew that it was partially my fault, but Joseph never mastered veiling his emotions. Maybe I was overcome by his words and didn't want to bear the responsibility of loving him back. I only looked up to one man in my life, and it wasn't him. The long drive home was also filled with empty noise. I usually sat in the front, since I was the older one out of me and Eli, but I let him sit next to Joseph this time. I wanted nothing to do with him. Instead, my eyes were fixed on the backseat window, and my mind freely roamed around wherever it pleased. The drive took over 2 hours, and I anxiously looked forward to hiding myself in my room back on Woodley Drive. I longed for its company. Spending a week up in the hills of Pennsylvania wore me down. I could have been in school this whole time, but school wasn't the place I wanted to be either. I wished there were a way to somehow leave the busyness and expectations of this world. I guess that was what hunting in the middle of nowhere was supposed to do, but I only felt more weight on my shoulders. School seemed less of a burden than this hunting trip. After a few turns down winding roads with bare trees placed along them, we finally arrived at our brick-faced house. I could see Mom staring through the front window, peering out as we turned into our drive. When she saw Joseph's black truck, she immediately knew it was us and ran out to meet us with only her morning robe and winter boots on. Mom's brunette hair waved in the crisp air. She smiled a genuinely content smile, her white teeth hidden behind her naturally pink lips. She always struck me as a strangely confident woman. As we all unpiled from the inside of Joseph's truck, Mom was intrigued by the 2 bucks we lugged with us in the back. She asked who shot them, and Eli proudly claimed his. Joseph tried to tell her that I shot the second, but I told her the truth. I was surprised Joseph would lie to my mother, or maybe he wanted her to think I actually did something productive during that week. We hightailed it inside, where I finally felt the cozy warmth of my home and all of its smells it brought. I immediately went to take off my coat and boots, but Joseph said we had to move the deer before we could settle on in. This whole time, Eli and Joseph dealt with the bucks themselves, so I didn't know why he would even consider me as someone to help him. But off we went, back into the frigid air. I thought that moving the heavy deer would take a long time, like it did for Eli and Joseph earlier. But with all 3 of us working together, we managed to get them off the bed in no time. Joseph said it was record-breaking, but I disagreed. Once we finally were inside for good, Mom had already prepared a warm pot of cocoa on the stove. I could smell the chocolate and the cinnamon mixed in the bubbling milk from all the way in the foyer. It smelled like old times, times I wished were never brought up to the surface again. I usually avoided those moments, but the soothing smell lured me into the kitchen. Mom had 3 large mugs on the counter for us. "For marshmallows, just the way you like it, honey," Mom said as she handed me a steaming mug of creamy hot cocoa, then kissing my forehead. Joseph stayed for dinner that night. Joseph was always over for dinner. I hardly remembered going a few days without him sitting at our table. Ever since he and Mom met my sophomore year, they were always inviting each other over for meals. Joseph lived in a small apartment complex on the other side of town, so we usually never went to his home. I didn't quite understand why Joseph lived in such a cramped apartment when he was an architect. He claimed he worked for major contractors in upstate New York, but he had no pictures to prove it, and his too cozy of a home sure didn't lend me the thought either. There were times I wondered if Joseph was nothing more than a compulsive liar. I told Mom that too one time, and she immediately admonished me. She said he was designing a new building in the area when she met him, and he showed her the blueprints. I never got to see those blueprints, but I apparently passed the building many times after it was supposedly built. There we were, the 4 of us gathered around the table. The first time Joseph ever came over, he sat in my dad's seat, and I yelled at him. He quickly grasped that he was never to sit there. Mom told me to stop screaming, but I could tell she too wanted that seat reserved. I knew that because she always had an extra dinner set at that table, and it was always placed where Dad used to sit. Maybe she didn't stop having feelings for him. We were cordially eating our dinners, the others lightly conversing while I kept to myself, while Joseph directed a question to me. "Did you apply to any colleges yet, Sonny?" My eyes immediately looked up from my food and stared directly into his eyes. I didn't know what to feel. I felt anger and pain, but it seemed like pain was the victor. I knew that I needed to leave before I bursted out on him. After sitting there like a stunned deer, I stood up and walked away. As I trudged upstairs to my bedroom, Joseph didn't know what he had done. He looked confused, so he glanced over at my mother for a reason as to why I was so upset. "His father called him Sonny," she said. The first memory of my father was when I was only 3 years old. He took me up to Cleveland as a day trip. It was a long drive, but we managed to have some time to eat at a local place before we headed over for the Indians game. We lived on the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania, so we often mingled in both states. My father liked to joke that we were dual residents. At the time, I didn't know what he meant by that, but if he was laughing about it, I thought maybe I should too. My father's friend, Jonathan, was with us. Jonathan now reminded me of how physically similar he and Joseph were. They both were slender yet lean. Their necks were long and their faces had similar defined features. The difference between them were their personalities. Jonathan was bold while Joseph was more reserved. I preferred Jonathan's boldness. Jonathan, Dad, and I ate our fill and headed over to Progressive Field to watch the ball game. The stadium was packed, and the seats we had were surrounded with noisy fans who weren't even from our own home team. They were out-of-staters or loyal fans from the other team, because they booed my father whenever the Indians got a home run. My father was not a man who was fascinated with sports. He never went to football games. He never forced me into any sports at school. The only time our television was on the ESPN channel was whenever our relatives came over. My dad didn't hunt either. However, he loved baseball. He never was an avid team supporter, but we often went up to Cleveland to watch the Indians play. We had a beautiful lush forest that ran right up to our backyard. In that forest lay a creek that ran from a stream that ran from the Ohio River, and many times my father and I would take strolls in the woods and stop off there. One time, we made a whole afternoon around it. He packed our lunches, and we carried our brown bags of peanut butter sandwiches and applesauce as we happily walked through that wood. It started to war a path for us since we often went to the creek. The creek itself was deep enough for little fish to swim in, so we took our fishing poles and tackle and sat on the water's edge, dipping our toes in the refreshing waters. We also splashed around in the water many times. We didn't have a pool, so whenever the sun decided to blister us that day, Dad and I would make a run for the creek. We would jump in with only our underwear on, and we would see the little fish swim away as we got in. The bottom of the creek was rocky, which kept the water crystal clear. We would maintain our area by taking out the fallen leaves or picking up the runaway sticks from stormy nights. No one ever went to the creek. It was left all to ourselves, so Dad decided to name it. We went back and forth about what to call it, but after a while, Dad found the perfect name: Jonah Creek. I asked him why he chose that name, and he said the water ran down the creek as fast as Jonah ran away from God. He also convinced me at one time that fish as big as whales lived in there. My father said they only came out at night. So one time, I woke him up, trying to explain to him why we had to catch the whale. He slumped over to his other side, hoping I would go back to bed, but I kept pestering. "Dad," I nagged, "we can make a discovery." After a while, he came through. He got up out of bed when it was only 2:30 in the morning, and the two of us roamed in the woods with only a flashlight to light our way. Unfamiliar noises surrounded us, so I clenched onto my father's hand until we got to the creek. When we finally arrived, I felt my father hold on to me tighter, and I could sense something was wrong. He shushed me to keep quiet, but I had no idea what was happening. When I looked in the direction my father was facing, there I saw two glowing eyes staring back at us. He quickly positioned his flashlight at it. The coloring was one of a leopard with heavy cat features. The cat was in the creek, but I couldn't tell what it was hunching over. Whatever it was, he must have killed it, because his mouth drenched with blood. Dad slowly walked backwards, tugging me along as well. The cat didn't do anything except for stare at us. When we couldn't see the cat anymore, my father swooped me up in his arms and bolted out of the woods as fast as he could. His heart beat so fast I could feel it against my own body. When we finally made it out alive, he reprimanded me for wanting to go explore in the dead of night. I saw that he was upset with himself too for listening to a kid. After his harsh yelling, and as I started to cry, he scooped me up in his arms again, holding me tighter than it was comfortable. I wanted him to let me go, but he kept on squeezing me. I guess he thought he might have lost me that night, and didn't want to have me get that close to death again. I made a friend on Woodley Drive. His name was Zach. He was my age, only a few months older, who had sharp red curls and at least a dozen freckles on his face. He was shorter than the average boy, but he became his own person, always curious about something. He and his parents moved just down the road from us when I was only a year old. Ever since then, Zach and I became friends. We would play together outside every day in the summer if the weather was fair to us that day. We always did something together, just the two of us. We were practically brothers, except that I was taller and had blonde hair. He was also borderline husky, while I was more slender and lean. After the episode with what happened at Jonah Creek, I stayed away from that place for a while, dark or light. However, when I eventually told Zach what happened, he eagerly tried to get me to go with him to see what happened. I told him that it happened a week ago and the cat was gone, but he kept insisting to see the place anyway, so the two of us trekked through the woods as the sun peered through the trees. I jumped at every unusual sound that I heard. Zach looked scared too, but we kept on walking until we made it to Jonah Creek. "Whoa!" he exclaimed as we glanced at what was in the water. "What is it?" "Looks to me like bones of an animal." It must have been one huge animal too. The bones made up to an animal way bigger than me. Zach and I were so fascinated by how clean the bones were. That cat must have had quite a feast last night. We ran to get my father, but I forgot that he worked in the summer as a teacher at a local community college. We decided to tell Mom instead, and she was interested, so we showed her the bones. She told us they were the remains of a dead deer. "A buck more like it," she told us. "A buck?" I asked her. "A buck is one big male deer, Simon," she said. "How do you know?" She pointed at the bones which looked like the head. "See, only bucks have antlers." If the weather was poor that day, Zach and I would go over one's house and we'd stay there overnight, even though the rain might have lasted a good 20 minutes. We were only 3 houses down, so it was more common than not that one of us were over another's house. I started to become part of his family, eating dinner with him and his parents and watching TV together. Zach started to become part of my family too. We would build forts out of couch cushions and blankets. Dad would check up on us and make sure we were sleeping before he went to bed at night. But when he and my mom were fast asleep, the 2 of us would turn on our flashlights and light up our fort with its glowing light. Then we would look at each other, giggling and feeling rebellious because we defied my parents' orders to fall asleep. We wouldn't do much more than that, other than maybe whisper conversations back and forth. One time, we must have whispered so hard that my father came stomping downstairs and demanded we give him the flashlights and go to bed. But when he left, we kept on giggling and carrying on. Thank you so much for listening to my very first chapter of my novel, The Way Back. Again, if you really like the story and you want to help me out, thank you so much for considering that, and the best way to do that is to write a review. It helps me get noticed, as I said earlier, into the podcast world so more people can listen to this book. Alright, I think that's it. If you are interested in continuing, the more people who listen to this, the more motivated I will be to upload sooner. I don't know when the next time I'll be uploading the next episode, but please check in every once in a while because I hope to be doing this regularly. Alright, thanks. Bye.